the literature is vast and rapidly expanding. If you just do a very simple Web of Science search on climate change and salmon, you quickly get overwhelmed by having to do that as just a side part of your regular job. So my review is more comprehensive than that, but it's a large literature. So it was begun in as part of the supplemental biological opinion that NOAA Fisheries conducted on the Columbia River hydro system. And climate change was a key uncertainty in planning for how the hydro system might affect salmon. So as part of the adaptive management implementation plan, we did a fairly thorough review of all the information relating to climate impacts on salmon, and since then I've been doing annual updates to see if there's any new information that might require a change in management. But it ends up being a fairly comprehensive review covering, at this point, so it kind of depends how you count them, the papers that were initially looked at versus the ones that actually appeared in the reports. But about 1,100 papers have appeared in these reports, and this is a website where they're at, and I'm currently trying to consolidate it. Well, this talk is part of consolidating it into a single document that has a summary of all these years of review. So that should be available soon. So just an overview of where the literature, and I'll say actually the reports actually include some physical climate summaries, papers on just the physical changes in the environment, observed trends and projections, but for this talk I'm only going to focus on the ones that are specific impacts on salmon. So the big picture, the vast majority of this literature is on the freshwater side. The both category generally means it's sort of either a whole life cycle or adult to adult counts, which incorporates both marine and freshwater, but the observations are typically still in freshwater. So there are about a third of the papers that relate to the marine environment, and often they're about the larger marine ecosystem and not just salmon. So currently, the majority of our information is in freshwater systems. The key drivers that are being examined in relation to climate are primarily temperature. So I put flow as a small thing in parentheses there because it is included in some of these studies, but certainly the dominant factor in terms of experimental work and attributions is generally temperature. In the marine realm, I wrote mixed marine conditions because it's often hard to separate out any one factor. In the marine world, it's even harder than it is in the freshwater system, where you can do at least some direct experimentation, manipulating conditions. But temperature is a very large factor associated in the marine drivers too. Ocean acidification, various species interactions and other stressors constitute, I guess I would say, growing part of the literature. Okay, so what is the basic story? I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. It's certainly important. Something we've been seeing from all of the talks is that the physical effects are spatially variable. What you're going to see varies from high elevation to low elevation, from interior to coastal ranges. There's a diversity of physical impacts. There's at least as much diversity in biological impacts, even just within salmon. So you can think, oh, that's a pretty simple system compared to all these other freshwater systems, aquatic insects or whatever that you might be interested in. But salmon has a lot of diversity within it, from how long they spend in freshwater, the fact that they move around quite a bit, and how old they are when they return, et cetera. So even so, within species and between species of salmon, you really do have quite a bit of variation in how they'll be affected. That said, I will vastly simplify this and give kind of just the large take-home stories. So in freshwater, clearly the dominant drivers that have received most of the attention are direct temperature stress, the surpassing of actual limits, these threshold temperatures where that's either lethal or clearly stressful, as well as a shift in the flow regime. If it was traditionally very strongly snow-dominated. That's switching more to a stream-dominated, or, a transitional basin where you get a shift in the peak flows, sometimes from spring all the way to winter. It can be shifted to a rain-dominant system, or just different time of year, as well as shifts lower low flows in many cases in the summer. These factors are very strongly correlated with salmon life history. They actually do survive and currently populate many areas that exceed these thresholds. In some parts of the year they have adaptations to them, but they're very locally adapted. And so it's this interesting question of, to what extent can one type of salmon start to look like another type of salmon, for example, and how does that work with the Endangered Species Act? Or will it just become inhospitable altogether? So these physical factors have both direct impacts, which are what are most often considered, and then, of course, the indirect impacts through the community changes. So I'm not going to go into detail about the ocean impacts, partly because they're really complicated, and that's kind of all I want you to take away from my discussion of the ocean today. That's the scientific clarification part. It's certainly not just temperature. I've just pulled one variable out of the mixing depth of the ocean, the currents, shifting, large-scale atmospheric processes that are essentially just not quite as straightforward, either what they are from a physical point of view or what their impacts will be on salmon. Okay, so but overall, in terms of population persistence, what it really comes down to is growth and survival. If they can't survive to reproduction, or they can't grow sufficiently to produce an adequate number of offspring, clearly populations will go extinct. So that's the bulk of the literature is measuring in some way or another some aspect of these two things. Survival also, salmon don't often starve to death. Usually they're eaten. And invasive species are a major increasing concern with climate change. Some of the more voracious ones are very warm adapted and likely to be better adapted to a warmer stream than salmon. There are also a lot of other salmonids that are that develop this competition, competitive dynamic, which influences survival. But aside from sort of the factors that go into growth and survival, is a very complicated life history and phenology adaptations that salmon have, and they're very, very finely tuned to local climatic conditions. So this is the factor actually that's probably most sensitive to climate. And this includes things like the timing of juvenile and adult migration, spawning, et cetera, as well as the age at which they migrate to freshwater or return, whether they even go out at all, or just stay in freshwater, or whether they might repeat spawn. Some of the species are capable of this, but it depends on a variety of factors. So I actually did a review separate from this review that was published earlier this year that focused very specifically on observed phenotypic changes that were attributed in the paper to climate factors. So this is across all fish, not just salmon, but any observation of a phenotypic trend that was attributed by the author to climate. And that was published in a special issue of Evolutionary Applications that did similar reviews for every other taxon you can think about. So if you're interested in this question, you should definitely check out this special issue. There's lots of other papers on other taxa. But the bottom line for this is that the majority of the traits that are associated with climate change are these phenology traits, the migration timing, as well as growth and size, as I mentioned before. And most of these are assumed to be non-genetic responses. They aren't largely evolutionary responses. There is some evidence for for evolutionary responses. And I'm not going to go into detail in that, but just there are a couple of papers that have identified shifts that appear to be due to evolutionary processes. There are additional topics that are covered in the literature. It's not just those. It's not just survival, growth, and behavior. There's issues about sex determinations, skeletal and muscle morphology, swimming ability, variety of other behaviors that come into it. There are also substantial concern about interacting stressors. So it's not just about temperature and flow. It's also about hypoxia, contaminants, the fact that when they're thermally stressed, they're much more sensitive to handling. Interception by fisheries and certain diseases are much more of a problem under warm water conditions. And of course, there's the larger ecosystem food web changes. But overall, so just to sort of break out the literature here, so this is the growth and survival, and these are pretty direct, simple temperature or flow related metrics, because they're also often measuring growth or survival in these other stressors and species interactions. But then this is largely the life history and phenology piece. In the marine world, so that's the breakdown of freshwater responses. In the marine world, you also have growth and survival, but they're measured differently. So we have a much narrower picture of what's happening in the marine world. We generally there are some surveys that track them very soon after they get to the ocean, so that first couple of months at sea, and then we pretty much don't see them again until they come back as adults. So we have a very different time scale of what we're able to see, and they aren't approaching lethal temperatures in that environment, so it's a much more synoptic description of the environment, and also it's a much longer food chain, and it's an open ecosystem. So you get these occasional predator waves, like Humboldt squid or something. An El Nino will bring in some totally new factor that was irrelevant in the ecosystem before that. They're there for a while and they disappear. And these factors are very hard to predict. And so we have a very different type of information and concerns, or just ability to predict what's happening in the marine world. So I'm not going to say much about ocean acidification. It doesn't appear to be a very direct negative effect on fish, based on what we know at this point. It certainly affects calcifying organisms. But the one food web model that came out this year on Puget Sound did actually try to track the impact on salmon and other fisheries, and they essentially found that there was enough layers in the food web that the impacts on fish were relatively minor. So you can use a simpler prediction of what's going to happen in terms of ocean implications of climate change, something more simple like sea surface temperature, or what's also commonly done is you have these larger ecosystem models of productivity in the ocean and these deriving conclusions about impacts on higher trophic levels from that. The major uncertainties, I'd say, certainly out in the ocean, we do not have what's highlighted in red here are these upwelling systems, which are not very well characterized by the global models and are just now, this is some of the really recent models, are really developing the level of high resolution that you need to try to understand productivity in the near shore. That's driving a lot of the productivity of these currents. As well as, like I said, we don't have a really good ability, I think, to predict either how the ocean is going to respond or how salmon are going to respond to the ocean. So in summary, this is just breaking out some of those response traits a little bit into slightly finer resolution. And the take-home point here is really that climate impacts everything we think of measuring. Pretty much haven't measured anything that's not affected by climate. And it's relatively equally distributed over the life cycle, I would say. So one approach to trying to capture all of these diverse effects is through life cycle modeling, and there are some really neat, more complicated genetic and evolutionary models that are being done on Atlantic salmon, which are really cool, but they're not terribly practical for a large spatial area. So to say the direction we're going, since I've been told to stop, is more spatial, relatively population-specific vulnerability assessments. And this is where you really need to go to figure out for an individual population which of these impacts really is most important and how serious is it. And just say the bottom line for that, I'm going to get yelled at soon, is that the ones that are already in the most trouble tend to also be in the places that are very climatically vulnerable. So it's a huge conservation concern. The only good news about that is that restoration actions could be very effective, because a lot of what we've done already to modify ecosystems is in the same direction as what climate change is doing. If we can reduce what we've done, it will go a fair amount to mitigating some of that ongoing climate change, and there are resources available to identify what would be appropriate actions to mitigate for different types of climate change. So in conclusion, we have different information about marine and freshwater ecosystems. The interactions among stressors and across ecosystems are very important. Even though we don't know the details for every population, the general restoration actions are relatively clear. I would argue that we know what to do.